My guest right now is Robert George. Who is Robert George, you ask? Well, I told you the details. I'll say it again. He is McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. There is so much more to say. He's someone I've known for many years, principally through my friendship with the great Chuck Colson. Robbie, as he lets us call him, has a new book out called Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth, Law and Morality in Our Cultural Moment. Robbie George, welcome back.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back with you, Eric.
Well, you're just seeing your face is an encouragement to me. You're one of those people. You give me great hope. You, there is so much to say about you, but let's just, I guess, stick to the book. What led you to put out this book, Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth, Law and Morality in Our Cultural Moment?
Well, I've been teaching the young men and women entrusted by their families to my charge as students at Princeton for 4 decades now. And over the course of the last decade, I've written various essays on various topics. And looking back over those essays, I saw that they were really integrated around a set of central themes that are very much on the minds of young men and women these days. What is truth? Why should we be concerned about truth? Why should we prioritize truth? Is there such a thing as truth? Or is there just your truth and my truth? There are a lot of forces in the culture that are telling young people today, no, there's really no such thing as objective truth. There's just your truth and my truth, and you can sort of choose. I also began to be worried, and this is for more than a decade, that people have given up on the two traditional sources of knowledge and wisdom, and those are faith and reason. And faith and reason have been replaced in people's minds, and especially the minds of young people, with a belief that our access to truth, if there is any such thing as truth, is simply our feelings, simply our emotions. And of course, if that's the case, then it generates the idea that, well, since our emotions and feelings vary from person to person, you have your truth and I have my truth. So I thought, I'll gather these essays together, present them as an integrated whole, address these themes with a view to saying to a general audience, but particularly young people, and this is why I hope that parents and grandparents will get this book into the hands of their high school and college age kids, especially to young people. Look, truth matters. It's really important. It's really important to prioritize seeking truth. We'll never get at it perfectly. We'll never get at it fully, but let's get at it the best we can. Let's deepen our understanding of truth because it really is much better to live in touch with reality than with fantasies. Let's stop relying on our feelings. Let's use the twin resources, the two wings, as the late Pope John Paul II described them, on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of truth, faith and reason, to get at the truth of things. And then let's be courageous in speaking the truth. I see my vocation as a teacher, Eric, to form the young men and women entrusted to my care to be determined truth seekers and courageous truth speakers. And I'm going to do that now with a broader audience of young men and women, not just my students at Princeton.
Well, when you just mentioned the two wings, you said faith and reason, right? Just so I'm getting
Right.
this right. I always thought that originated with the late, great Michael Novak, but you obviously he got that from Pope John Paul II.
He did, yeah. It's the beginning sentence of Pope John Paul's great encyclical Fides et Ratio, which is the Latin for faith and reason. The idea that faith and reason are the two wings on which the human spirit rises to contemplation of truth.
Well, whenever I hear, faith and reason put together that way, I always think of, the famous, I guess, fourth century question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?
Yeah, that's Tertullian's question.
Yeah. And that is the question. I mean, I guess I was speaking to Melanie Phillips recently at a Socrates in the City event, and we were talking about what is the West. And for me, I think she differed with me on this, but for me, that is the West. Athens and Jerusalem, faith and reason. And it's something that we've taken for granted for centuries, and we've, in various ways struggled to live up to, what these things mean, or mean to God, I think. But it is interesting right now that we're in a new part of the struggle where people are no longer even thinking of reason as reasonable. That we have
Yeah.
people that think of reasoning and logic as patriarchal constructs. What is at the root of the denigration of reason?
Well, I think it's the loss of faith. Because reason really does depend for its support on faith, just as faith depends on reason to work on the data of faith to draw conclusions about what we ought to be doing and not doing, what it means to live a truly human, a fulfilled human life. Eric, the historians are fond of breaking up the epochs, you know this, into the age of this and the age of that. And so some historians say the medieval period, that was the age of faith. And what they mean by that is that for the great medieval thinkers, whether they were Jewish or Christian or Muslim, figures like Maimonides or Aquinas or Averroes, the fundamental touchstone of truth, of justice, of goodness, of rightness was conformity with the teachings of religion, the teachings of faith. And then these same historians tell us that, well, the Enlightenment comes along, and that's the age of reason. So now the touchstone for the great Enlightenment figures, whether in Germany or in France or in England or in Scotland, the great touchstone of truth and rightness and justice is conformity with reason or with scientific inquiry. Now, both of those are partly true and partly misleading. The medievals certainly prioritized faith, but they were no slouches when it came to reasoning as well, and they did not neglect the importance of reason. And in many cases, Enlightenment figures were not just people of science. Even those who were men of science were often also men of faith. Newton is a very good example, but of course there are many, many, many others. Well, if the medieval period was the age of faith, and if the Enlightenment is the age of reason, in what age do we live? What's our touchstone of goodness, of truth? I'm afraid, I fear that it has become feeling. We live in the age of feeling. And that is the high road to catastrophe because our feelings are extremely unreliable indicators of goodness, of justice, of truth, of rightness. We do need to return to faith and reason. And there's no way you just go back to one without the other. For the great Christian thinkers, again, going all the way back to Augustine, reason really matters. It doesn't displace faith. It's not a competitor to faith. But faith and reason work in a kind of harmony. That's true for the great Jewish thinkers as well. I mentioned Maimonides earlier, a very good example of that. Well, that's where we need to go. We need to recover the true sources of wisdom, and those are in faith and reason.
Where did this go wrong? I always go back to Rousseau, I guess. The this idea that somehow our feelings, I mean, yeah, where did that idea come from in history, in intellectual history?
Well, the trouble, Eric, as you know, when you start trying to trace things back, especially where things have gone wrong, you go back and you go back and you go back, and the next thing you know, we're in the Garden of Eden, and that
Right,
serpent is presenting
right.
himself and tempting our mother Eve. But certainly put your finger on a key moment. Rousseau's abandonment of the idea of reason and the idea that we live by a kind of natural instincts and they'll guide us in the right way, that human beings are naturally good, and where human beings have gone wrong is by basically having civilization imposed on them. That's a very bad idea. But it's not just Rousseau. You might recall the very famous passage from Hume, David Hume, the 18th century skeptical British thinker. Hume said that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and may pretend to no office other than to serve and obey them. For Hume, and he was very influential, for Hume, reason cannot tell us what to want. It can't adjudicate among competing wants. It can only play the instrumental role of helping us more efficiently to get what we want, whatever we happen to want. So Mother Teresa might want one thing, and Hitler might want another thing. On Hume's reading, no reason, there's no rational basis for adjudicating between Hitler's wants or desires and Mother Teresa's wants and desires. All reason can do is tell Mother Teresa how to save more people on the streets of India, and it can tell Hitler how to kill more people in the ovens of Auschwitz. That's obviously a very bad idea. But
That's
Hume himself didn't invent it. I mean, go a generation or two, a couple of generations earlier, back to Thomas Hobbes, a very influential thinker, who
Robbie,
says the
hang on one
thoughts are,
second.
yeah.
We're going to go to a hard break here. When we
Oh,
come
sure.
back, we'll get back to Thomas Hobbes, ladies and gentlemen. Don't go away. Welcome back, folks. I'm talking to Robbie George, or as the title of the book says, Robert P. George, who's at Princeton, the city, the university, or the town, the university. The new book is called Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth, Law and Morality in Our Cultural Moment. Robbie, you were just making a statement about Thomas Hobbes. Please continue.
So I quoted that famous passage of David Hume's, the great 18th century British skeptical philosopher, that our reason is and ought only to be the slave of the desires and may pretend to no office other than to serve and obey them. But I was pointing out that even before that, you go back a couple of generations to the figure of Thomas Hobbes, an enormously influential figure in the history of Western thought, especially Western political thought, who's writing in the context of a great civil war. And Hobbes says that the thoughts, by this he means the intellect, the thoughts are to the desires as scouts and spies to range abroad and find the way to the thing desired. It's that same idea that's now filtering in with Hobbes. The idea that our thoughts can't tell us, our intellect can't tell us what we should want. It can only find the way to whatever we desire. It can only help us more efficiently to attain what we want, whatever we want. The great teaching of Christianity, of Judaism, and of the classical tradition, the tradition of Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, is that the intellect has something to say. It has a role to perform, not only in instrumentally figuring out how to get what we want, but in figuring out what it's worth wanting, in deciding what is good and what is bad.
Well, there's so much here. It's amazing. And I'm always fascinated about how people can push things too far. I mean, I know that Martin Luther, about whom I've written a book, really I always find these things funny, despised Aristotle. I don't know why, maybe because he was just forced to read and study Aristotle so much, in the very early 16th century. And he really seemed to have problems with reason. And so people can make us or feel they want to make ourselves make a false choice, and to say you must choose between faith and reason, which is, to me, self-evidently ridiculous. But talk about that idea that there are people who seem to think it's got to be one or the other. They don't see them working together.
Yeah, and you see this from both sides. You'll see this in religious people, and you'll see this in hardcore secularists. My old Oxford colleague, who I knew very well in the old days, Richard Dawkins, for example. For religious people, some adopt a view that has come to be known in philosophy as fideism. And that's the idea that the only knowledge worth having, and certainly this is true, they say, of moral knowledge, the only moral knowledge worth having is knowledge that we have simply in virtue of revelation. If it's not in the scripture, we can't know it. We can't rely on our reason to get us anywhere in the vicinity of genuine, important moral knowledge. And then on the other side, the hardcore secularists, people like Dawkins and Hitchens and so-called new atheists, think that reason is our only guide to truth, and that faith proposes itself as an alternative to reason and must therefore be rejected. Why? Because we have no rational basis for affirming it. But I'm with you, Eric. I think that they are both wrong. I think there's a very good reason why the early Christian church did look for wisdom, not only in scripture, which is very important and preeminent, of course, but also in the teachings of the great pagan, to be sure, ancient thinkers. The idea for the early Christians and going forward was all truth is God's truth. If it's spoken by somebody who's a believer, that's great. If it's spoken by somebody who's an unbeliever, it's still true. If it's spoken by someone who's a pagan, especially a virtuous pagan, well, learn from it, take it on board, integrate it into our overall knowledge, which is exactly what Christianity did.
Well, I guess that's I've made this point innumerable times. All truth is of God. So if an idiot says 1 + 1 = 2, it's no less true because it was spoken by an idiot or a fool. And it is interesting how some people, I mean, I guess, the idea that reason is something that we shouldn't trust, there's a point to be made, right? In other words, we know that if we are fallen, reason, which can lead us to truth, also can lead us away from truth. I mean, we call that sophistry. So there's a reason to be suspicious of pure reason, and if our reason is leading us away from what the scripture says, then we have more reason to be suspicious of the way we are reasoning. But that doesn't mean we throw reason away. And so I guess when people like you mentioned, Richard Dawkins, his understanding of what faith is and what we can know, to me, becomes absolutely preposterous. I mean, this idea that the only things that we can know through scientific investigation. I mean, most people know that's preposterous, that you're reducing everything to a materialism, which is just silly. You can't live your life that way. And so it's interesting that we have these, I guess, people, as you were saying earlier, on both sides, getting it wrong on both sides. And I know that in your book, you're trying to help us understand what it means to use faith and reason, as I would say God wants us to do. We'll be right back, folks. I'm talking to Robbie George. The new book is called Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth. Talking to Robert P. George. The new book is called Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth, Law and Morality in Our Cultural Moment. And it is a grouping of essays. One of the first ones by Patrick Lee, or with Patrick Lee, is called The Nature and Basis of Human Dignity. That's a fascinating concept. If you do not believe in the biblical account that there is a loving God who created us in his image, there really is no basis for human dignity. I mean, if we just evolved out of the primordial soup via accident, then the concept of human dignity, I would argue, goes out the window. But there are people who they kind of want to have it both ways. They sort of believe in human dignity. They say, what do you have to say about that?
Well, what does it mean? What does it mean to say? What is the Bible telling us when it says that man, though made from the mere dust of the earth, is nevertheless fashioned in the very image and likeness, as you say, of the divine creator and ruler of all that is, the imago Dei, the idea of man being made in the image and likeness of God? Well, it doesn't mean that God has 5 fingers on each of 2 hands and hair on his head and a nose, because God is an immaterial reality. What could it mean then? Well, Thomas Aquinas, I think, has done better than anybody else in Christian history of giving us an account of what it means. What it means is that human beings, like God, enjoy reason and freedom, the godlike, literally godlike powers of reason and freedom, the power to envisage a state of affairs that does not exist, grasp, understand the intelligible point, the value of bringing that state of affairs into existence, and then to act reasonably, freely, to bring that state of affairs into existence, and not act like a brute animal acts on the basis of pure instinct or impulse. Well, a secularist, Eric, like my colleague at Princeton, Jeffrey Stout, that's a very good example of it. A secularist, someone like Professor Stout, will say, well, I can recognize that human beings have those godlike powers. We really are free. We really do have the power of reason. We really can envisage states of affairs that don't exist and freely, on the basis of our rational grasp of the intelligible point of bringing them into existence, bring them into existence. Those are godlike powers. The thing is, someone like Stout would say, I believe we don't get them from God, that we're not created in the image of God. We have created God in our image. We have these godlike powers. They are, as you insist, Professor George, the basis of our dignity, but there is no divine source of them. Now, I'll then ask the next question. Well, Brother Jeff, where did they come from? How is it the case that the world includes creatures who have these literally godlike, immaterial powers of reason and freedom? And his response to that, or a great secularist response to that, an intelligent secularist response to that, will simply be, I don't know, it's inexplicable. I'm not buying the God version of the story. All I know is that we do, in fact, have these qualities. They distinguish us from the brute animals, and they are the foundations of our dignity as human creatures.
There's so much in the book, and I look forward to speaking you at Socrates in the City soon on all of this. But I just wanted to touch at the end of the book. Part 4 of the book is called "Seekers of Truth and Bearers of Witness." You have a chapter on Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Yes.
I assume talking about. I assume you're touching there on his 1978 speech to the Harvard undergraduates.
That's right. I talk about that speech. I was actually at Harvard at that time. I wasn't in the yard, but I heard the speech over the broadcast system. I was outside the walls. There was a simultaneous translation. I talk about that speech, and I talk about his 1983 Templeton address as well. I talk about 2 speeches, and it's the Templeton address in which he says the root of our problems is simply this: men have forgotten God. And I think he's hit the nail on the head there. And with the collapse of faith comes the collapse of faith in reason.
You also have a chapter on Heinrich Heine, which I quote him in my Bonhoeffer book. He's essentially prophetically prophesying the rise of Nazism, and you have a chapter on Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, whom I had the privilege of meeting. He spoke at Socrates in the City a number of years ago, as did you. But the final chapter, and this is where we out you, Professor George, as a banjo player. I've heard you play banjo a few times. You have as your final chapter Ralph Stanley, the famous bluegrass phenomenon, Ralph Stanley. Why do you have him in the book?
Well, Eric, I will plead that I came by my banjo picking honestly. I was born and brought up in West Virginia, right in the heart of Appalachia. I had a kind of Huck Finn boyhood, hunting and fishing and playing bluegrass banjo. And Stanley was a banjo hero of mine. I had 3 great banjo heroes. Of course, Earl Scruggs, who's usually credited with founding the bluegrass style of banjo playing, a guy named Don Reno, and then Ralph Stanley. Stanley's in the book because of the way he combined his musical vocation with his witness to the Christian faith. I particularly was arrested by a PBS broadcast that I saw in which he was interviewed. I don't know what the interviewer's name was, but he was one of the standard issue PBS secular liberal news people. And he was just flummoxed by Ralph Stanley's absolutely effortless, unself-conscious proclamation of the Christian faith, just in his ordinary explanation of what he did and why he did what he did and how he came by his music and what he thinks his music means. He was expressing his Christian faith and just bearing witness to this guy who, coming from a completely alien sort of culture, the culture that you're very familiar with there in New York City, the culture of PBS, the culture I'm familiar with at Princeton, just was trying to make sense out of this. It was an amazing episode, and it was the impetus to write that. What it began was a tribute to Stanley after he died.
Well, I'm just thrilled that you squeezed him into the book. That's amazing. We're out of time, Robbie. I will see you soon to continue the conversation. Folks, the book is Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth, Law and Morality in Our Cultural Moment. Professor Robert P. George, thank you.
My pleasure, Eric. Thank you.